One of the disadvantages of coming at the end of this kind of rich discussion is that there's not much else to say. So those of you who know that I speak too long will be delighted to know that I don't have much to say. I guess I'm an optimistic pessimist in this scale. And my God, there's Juliet or Romeo leaning out of the balcony up there. I didn't realize there was extra entertainment here. And this looks like the set from Judgment at Nuremberg. But I think one of the things we have to remember in all of this is that there's a biophysical reality out there which we really have to pay attention to. The climate science is pretty firm and pretty hard, with the exception of places on the Potomac. It's not debated very much any longer. And there are drop-dead dates, literal kind of drop-dead dates, beyond which, if we progress or move as a planet, we are creating a lifestyle and a future that nobody's going to particularly want. And so we're going to have to operate within the boundaries of the planetary boundaries as described by the Stockholm Environment Institute. And that means that we are bumping up against our capacity to be able to do a number of things, not the least of which is to burn stuff. And so that's going to force the kinds of rapid transitions on us that we've been talking about here, whether we like it or not. And I think we have to keep that front and center. Because we have basically failed to take action on climate change since Prime Minister Mulroney hosted the Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere in 1988, whose declaration began by saying mankind is conducting an uncontrolled experiment whose consequences can be second only to those of a nuclear war. This was the first meeting between the scientific community and the political community around both Mrs. Brundtland, the chair of the famous Brundtland Commission, and Mulroney. Since then, we've done very little. We've known the extent of the problem. We've talked about it. We've talked a very good line in international meetings. But now we've basically become takers when it comes to how we behave with these issues. Our Kyoto target was essentially determined by Helmut Kohl and Tony Blair mugging Jean Chrétien in Europe. Our Copenhagen target was determined by the United States. I sat in a meeting with the Canadian delegation in which the minister, Jim Prentice, a decent man, said, remember, if you're asked what our target is, tell them it's the same as the Americans. And I said, okay, Minister, what's the American target at the moment? He said, I don't know, we have to find out. So this is evidence-based decision-making when it comes to climate change. That also happens after all the huffing and puffing in the last election to be the Canadian medium-term target under the Paris Agreement, the one that Mr. Harper got from President Obama before he left office. And our longer term, the 2050 target, is one that's been determined by a combination of scientific consensus, the G7, and the Paris meeting. So we're going to have to live within these sorts of constraints. So if the question of the day is, can we maintain a vibrant, profitable, and active fossil fuel industry while at the same time making the transition to the low-carbon economy, which the rest of the world is increasingly doing at a very rapid rate? I'm not sure. And it's much trickier than we may think because we have little control over how this is going to progress. So let me add 4 observations here. These are more in the political realm, or the social realm, I guess. And I think one of the problems we have, and it's not just Canada, but one of the problems we have as an industrial society is that we still don't have a really convincing narrative of what the low-carbon future would actually look like. Now, generation energy is a good start, Jay, and I know that Jim Carr is serious about this, but there's a long road to travel. People think it's sort of hair, shirts, and living in a cave with candles, the old image of the environmentalists in the 1990s. What does it mean for mobility? What does it mean for urban form? What does it mean for day-to-day life? Do you still have jobs? What kind of jobs do you have? How do you get around? And so on and so forth. And that's a narrative we have to build, and we have to build it fairly quickly. And that's where the visual arts will become important. It's not going to be done by geeks and technocrats like us, because we're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Standing in front of an audience of normal people and talking about gigawatts and parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is a recipe for a sound sleep. So the second issue I think we have to think about, and this is something that we can take lessons from our cousins to the United States in, is how do we have 2 minutes, okay, I'll talk even more quickly. How do we avoid making this how do we avoid making climate change into a partisan issue? It's now not respectable for a U.S. Republican to have any more than one opinion on climate change. It's become part of the cloak. It's part of the social media they follow. I remind you that Mr. Trudeau's government has been living in la-la land ever since it was elected. You had a major change of government in Alberta. You had a sympathetic government in Ontario, one in BC and one in Quebec. That apple cart may be beginning to be upset, and that's not going to be good for trying to make the pan-Canadian framework continue to function. So we're going to have to try and find a way to have conversations with people we normally don't have conversations with. And then finally, I remind you we don't really have much choice. The future is coming very quickly. As Mike and others have articulated, big lumpy investments have very long time frames, and what we decide to do now for urban infrastructure, for example, will be what we're living with for the next 40 or 50 years. But there is a hard stop, and there are hard stops along the way, and they're going to be given to us by Earth and its operating systems, and we're going to have to operate within that, even if the economics of change become very uncomfortable. Thank you. Did I do 2 minutes?